This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shandlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we really like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you.
Our guest today is Dr. Yair Wallach. He's a senior lecturer in Israel Studies at SOAS, University of London, as well as the head of the Center for Jewish Studies there, and an old friend of the Tel Aviv Review podcast. His new book, A City in Fragments, Urban Texts in Modern Jerusalem, was published by Stanford University Press in 2020, and we're very delighted to welcome him to the studio. Hello, Yair, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so
That's
it's a great
wonderful.
So are we, by the way.
Wonderful. So, about your book, it's not just a historical monograph. More than that, even, it's a sociolinguistic and even a philosophical exploration of text as a political, social, and cultural artifact, and even, dare I say, an actor. So, what is your understanding of text as an object of research?
So the starting point is that text has a history, that the way we read and write changes profoundly, and therefore textual artifact, its meaning depends on the place it's located and the culture and the specific moment. And I think that's a key insight. And the question for me was, how does text change? How does reading and writing change? And what can we learn from it? I think that's the maybe the second thing is to think of text as a kind of technology, something that can be deployed. It's not just pure meaning; it has perfect purpose and function again, which change over time, and to understand the different roles that technology is employed for.
I had almost the opposite question. What is your understanding of a city as something that is best explored through text? Maybe not best, but you chose to explore it through text. And the reason I asked that is because I guess when I started thinking about it, reading your book, I think of text ever since the printing press as something that helps us transcend location. It connects people, city and country and everywhere else, mass distribution. So why did you choose to look at a specific city through the prism of text?
The idea was to look at the kind of textual technologies and artifacts that are usually left out of histories of text and reading. So most of the histories of reading really focus on the print press and books and various other printed material. So the idea was really to focus on the kind of text that today at least surround us and make our daily experience, but are rarely acknowledged and are rarely studied, and are rarely studied as a kind of one corpus or one economy of text. The city is therefore really important location as a site that is saturated with text, and it's a place where text is encountered in a very embodied way. The other reason to focus on a city, first of all, in the middle of the 19th century, text is primarily visible in cities. That in the rural areas in Palestine, you could still see text on coins or in holy tombs, but that was rare. So in the city, one of the things that distinguished a city was that textual saturation already in the middle of the 19th century, and the city also is a site of encounter and borders between different communities, and that was a chance to explore that, especially a place like Jerusalem, where you have different communities, different languages, and different political trajectories. So that kind of condensation allowed me to do a comparative study, for example, to look at Arabic and Hebrew in a very, very small, relatively geographical location, but very rich in history, but also in demography and so forth.
And when you started going about this research, how did you even approach this? I mean, it's sort of a methodological question. Okay, so you decided you wanted to study text and you wanted to study in Jerusalem, and how did you, fragment it into the really wide array of artifacts that you look at in your book, from number plates of buildings to stone inscriptions and whatever?
So the idea, the primary interest was just to understand how text functioned for readers and writers. And for that, I relied primarily on contemporary accounts. So that was the main, methodology and main difficulty. It was relatively easy to find what text was visible and where. I mean, Jerusalem is very, very well documented in a variety of ways. That wasn't the main challenge. The main challenge was to understand how text was read and how text was written, and to find moments of change where text starts meaning different things to local people in Jerusalem. So that means reading lots of memoirs, diaries, and press, official records, and so forth. And that was the main methodology. But to understand on which artifacts to focus, I looked at a huge amount of photography and paintings and corpuses of inscription and various other, and of course, walking the streets. I walked a lot in the streets of Jerusalem, and to try to find texts that are, from before 1948.
Yeah, I had this image of you walking around with like a big magnifying glass held up to your eyes and like peering at cornerstones on buildings and such. Did you do that?
I did walk quite a lot. I think kind of with my head up and trying to look for, and I did find some things that nobody found before me. British.
Like what? Give us an example.
So the only mandatory street sign that survived inside the old city in Jerusalem, which is David Street, which is Tariq Bazaar in Arabic, and that's a kind of blue and white Armenian ceramic tile. In 3 languages with the Hebrew effaced, and that's above a shop, and and all of them otherwise were removed by the Jordanian in around 1965 or 66 and replaced with Jordanian nameplates. So this is the only one that survived. But lots of things that also didn't make it to the book, like on sewage, on these kind of iron things, and on top of sewage holes and all these kind of things, and lots of text on names of villas in Talbiya or Baka and these kind of things. So I was walking a lot and thinking, what do these things mean, and and how do I understand how the people that put these signs, what do they have in mind?
Yeah, and of course, it's all about the social and political function of the text in this particular period of time that you look at, the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, more or less a century. And I'd like to ask you, how does your study correspond with the latest scholarship of late Ottoman Palestine around that area? Because on the one hand, as you point out yourself, this new scholarship of late Ottoman Palestine disputes the age-old dichotomy between the image of Ottoman Jerusalem as a run-down sort of backwaters city, and on the other hand, the so-called modern city it's become under the British and Zionist influences. So it disputes that thing. And on the other hand, the focus on the many aspects of modernization in the late 19th and early 20th century that come about through the text could potentially play into that very same dichotomy. How do you reconcile that tension of not looking at modernization and modernity in this very narrow sense?
So yes, I'm building on a rich scholarship of the last 20 years, starting with Salim Tamari, whose work is really, really important and really open up lots of questions and thinking both theoretically and historically, but then lots of names like Abigail Jacobson, Roberto Mazza, Michel Campos, Menachem Klein, and others. So I'm building on this, and kind of what I bring kind of I think emphasizes some trends or allows us to see them through different kind of different kinds of view. I think the first insight is to understand that the kind of dichotomy that emerges in the 20th century between the Zionist movement and Palestinian nationalism is not, we can say between colonizer and colonized, is not between modern and traditional. I think that's a key thing that is important. So both Jewish society, the Yishuv, and both Arab Palestinian society go through processes of modernization. In both cases, you have champions of modernization working against a very rich traditional background and traditional ways of thinking and doing things and understanding oneself.
And you're saying those processes happen in a way independent of the emerging sort of colonizing presence of Zionism.
Locally, yes, definitely. I mean, and we can see this both in Arab Palestinian, Muslim, Christians, but also in local Jewish society that embraces Hebrew in a modern way towards the turn of the century. Zionism, there's local Zionism, which is more cultural in view and more about cultural revival. Outsider Zionism brings a certain edge to it, which is very much about colonization, territorialization, taking over land, conquest, and transforming meaning. I think that's the edge of Zionism in that sense. So there is a clash between colonizers and colonized. The Jewish community, the local Jewish community, in some ways is colonized by Zionism, and you can see this in the kind of clashes, not just between the Orthodox and the new arrivals, but also between local modernizing circles within both Sephardic and Mizrahi, but also Ashkenazi, local Ashkenazi in Jerusalem, and the more kind of second Aliyah and so forth. That is one, I think, understanding that dynamic and understanding the kind of the champions of modernity within the local arena is really important. In the book, I bring Khalil Sakakini and Ibrahim Jabra and others as examples of local Palestinian intellectuals that were, fully excited and about this ability to rewrite themselves entirely and their society, and that's what modernism went for them. And on the other side, I bring local Jews in the Yishuv, and I bring Agnon and others who are much more ambivalent about this transformation. So that kind of communicates that dichotomy does not, it's not just about Jews versus Arab or Zionists versus Palestinians. It also cuts through these societies with the differences that I mentioned and other differences. Of course, there's cultural differences between different communities, the way that they use text. I think the other way, which I think I push in the book maybe more than others, is the way that Jerusalem is very much a colonial city, the way that a legacy of British colonialism in a way that people do not realize, I think. So we think of colonial cities as, Mumbai or New Delhi and, grand colonial architecture that we don't find in Jerusalem. But that the meaning of the city was profoundly shaped by the British in very careful interventions in town planning, in architecture, but also in the narrative of the city that really shaped the way we think of it as ancient city, segregated, holy city. And that's very, very different from the late Ottoman period where it was all about ruthless modernization, progress, building roads, building tramways, not so much caring about the historical fabric. So the Ottoman city was in a way much more modern than the British city, but the British city is the one that we live with in the way that we think about the city. I mean, most clearly through the kind of the stone cladding regulation that very much shaped the way that city looks, but also through the street names, which were about imposing the sacredness of the city on its new parts, all these kind of biblical names, to communicate that this is a holy city, even if the buildings were just 10 years or 20 years old.
I want to draw you out a bit exactly on that transition of understanding of the identity of Jerusalem from the late Ottoman period that you start off with in the mid-19th century. and then the changes that came with Mandate Palestine under the British, because you seem to argue that in the late Ottoman period, the way we think of Jerusalem today as this, segregated city, Jews against Muslims, and these mosaic of atomized communities that don't really overlap. You're saying it wasn't quite like that. They had a sort of somehow more overlap and shared identity, and then when the British came, they imagined it as a city of much more cultural clash. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Yeah, I mean, the late Ottoman city has it's a multi-faith and lots of communities, and much less segregated than we imagined, particularly in the old within the walls. So, for example, the 4 quarters of the city are not the way that people understood, of all communities. They had local names for the neighborhoods, which were not according to, mostly not according to denomination. Towards the end of the century, it emerges a local middle class, which is multi-faith, which is very much pushing the modernization and the expansion of the city, and driven by the local municipality, which is again a multi-faith. And there's local conflicts, but these conflicts are between, the middle class and the villagers outside the city, or the kind of the riffraff, and so forth. Not between Jews and Arabs, and not so much. I mean, there are examples. We can find alternative example, but the primary, locomotive for change is this kind of middle class, which very much embraces an Ottoman view of modernity.
And identity? Did they have a shared identity as Ottoman
Jerusalemites? Yes, definitely, very, very much so. I mean, I think it depends. It depends. But if you look at the educated middle class, then certainly, and there's an Ottoman sense of identity, and there's a Jerusalemite sense of identity, and you can see it also in the local press and so forth. How much you go along with this is a question for each community and for each person, but certainly you can see that. When the British arrive, they assume from the beginning that kind of thing does not exist.
So they come in with this assumption and imagination and then end up creating it?
Yeah, very much so.
Of a city in conflict and segregated?
Yeah, I mean, they assume that the city is a city of quarreling sects. That's their expression. And the idea is to keep a balance between different communities. And they see the city as primarily religious. So they give a voice to religious leaders and so forth that did not really have that, not to that extent in the late Ottoman period. And they assume that the city is segregated. And that's why the street names are important in order to map that segregation. They wanted to understand where they go in the street. Is it a Muslim street? Is it a Jewish street? So the easiest way is to put a sign that will tell you as a code that this is a Muslim street because the name is Muslim, or this is a Jewish street, and so forth. So that was one of the motivations why it was so urgent to put street names in 1920, immediately when the High Commissioner arrives. And that's when you assume that the city is segregated and sacred, then you create that inevitably. So, of course, there's the dynamic of their commitment to Zionism, the clash between Palestinians and Palestinian nationalism and Zionism, which then creates a much more segregated a reality. But for the British, this is not even in question. They assume that this is how the city works, and there is no attempt to try to prevent that.
Isn't it strange that we're talking about British Orientalism a week after we talked about Edward Said?
Just
right?
coincidentally.
Just coincidence. No, but also on this note, I'd like to ask you why you chose to focus on Jerusalem particularly, and not about Palestine as a whole, and maybe other places in Palestine that encountered similar processes, similar problems, cities maybe, Haifa or Jaffa, and other big sort of pseudo or semi-international cities. Is it because what you just discussed, that the British came with a very firm notion, image, idea of what Jerusalem is and should be, and therefore all these processes were implemented and carried out in a certain way that wasn't present in other places in Palestine?
So that's one consideration, because clearly, the British town planning in Jerusalem was the most important thing in terms of planning. For the British, they didn't care that much about planning for other cities in Palestine. But the main reason is that I was basically interested in textual modernity or modernity through text, but to understand that not as something that emerges out of nothing, not out of tabula rasa, but as something that emerges against older forms of text. Jerusalem was perfect, because Jerusalem is not a place where text didn't exist. It's a very richly textual city in terms of there's lots of inscriptions, there's lots of graffiti, and there's lots of other forms of text.
And
city.
Also its past or its image as a holy city. Its whole relationship with the scriptures, etc. Did it play a role as well?
Partly, but I think partly, a secondary role, in the sense that, what attracts Jewish donors to put commemoration plaques of themselves in Jerusalem is the fact that it's a holy city. But for me, the interesting thing is that suddenly you do have, and if you look at the early 19th century, there's hardly any Hebrew in the streets. And then you look at 1920 and there's 2,000 commemoration plaques all over the city and so forth. So there is from very little Hebrew to lots of Hebrew, or transformation from, very rich Arabic textual tradition in Islamic inscriptions, more than 300 that go back, millennia, to new forms of textuality. And to understand the new forms, it was useful to compare them to the old text and to see that the old texts lose their meaning, lose their function. And for that, Jerusalem was much more useful than Haifa. And Haifa would just be the emergence, but not the older forms of text. And I think the older forms are more difficult to understand, because when we see a street sign from the 20s, we know what this is and we feel a bit nostalgic or whatever. But when we see a commemoration inscription that we can barely read, it's so dense, we don't know really what to do with this kind of artifact. And to try to understand to the mode of thinking, a mode of subjectivity that puts that inscriptions and then ritually paints it, and how does it function, that kind of ways of writing and reading text, and what does that mean for society and subjectivity? For that, Jerusalem was really useful. And in order to understand the shift that comes with that new forms of textuality that I explore through street names, signs on shops, visiting cards, ID cards, banknotes, graffiti, political graffiti, and other forms of textuality. But to understand that, I needed to understand the older forms which actually go out of use during that period.
Do you think language can somehow presage political developments? And I'm thinking here of one very interesting example in which, as part of the entry of Hebrew into that space, at a certain point in, I think, 1936, one of the Arab intellectuals says, well, there's no end to this. In the end, we're going to have to be pushed out of here. How do the language dynamics, where do they fit into the political developments?
I think the political development comes first. I mean, it's very clear, Hebrew is visible, very visible in Jerusalem in 1910. And that's not a problem for anyone. I mean, I've not seen anyone voicing disapproval of the fact that Hebrew is present, including, the big sign of Bezalel. Bezalel is the Zionist bastion in Jerusalem. Nobody had this. They had a pavilion.
The Art Academy.
Yeah. This was, the pioneers coming. That was there. Then there were not many new kinds of Zionists in Jerusalem, but Bezalel was one of their center. And they had the pavilion outside Jaffa Gate, which is the city center. I didn't see anyone objecting to it. During World War I, we see with the kind of much more ruthless Ottoman policies, and then they say, well, you need Turkish or Arabic at the top, And below that, you can have other languages, including Hebrew. But you can't have English or French because these are enemy languages. So this is one. But the big change comes in after 1917, 18, when it's clear that that Palestine is going to be, a Jewish national home, according to Balfour Declaration. And it's in 1920 that you suddenly see the clash, when the first Arab-Palestinian demonstrations against the Balfour Declaration in the winter months, and Arabic steps out to the street as a national language in big signs in demonstrations saying Palestine is Arab and for the Arabs. And I think it's the first time that Arabic is used as a national Arabic language in Jerusalem in this sense. And Hebrew is suddenly seen as a colonial language by Palestinians. They understand that Hebrew can have a claim, or that the official use of Hebrew has a claim of possession, of taking over and changing the meaning of space. And that's when, in the same demonstration, we see signboards of the Rothschild Hospital in Jerusalem and, vandalized by the demonstrators. And this is a Jewish hospital. So suddenly we see Hebrew becoming a problem, which it wasn't before. And here the political development, I think, drive the attitude
towards the language.
Towards the language, yeah.
Reminds me so much of it reminds me so much of the famous image of the stop sign with arrête on it in Quebec, with the English, graffitied out during the height of Quebecois separatism there.
Yeah. I want to ask about the perspective or the research trajectory that you present here of studying a city through text, whether it's becoming a trend or a fashion among historians, because I think there could be similar studies on other cities. I don't know, tell me if they exist, because I was thinking, and not for the first time, that Istanbul could be an interesting case study as well. I often compare Jerusalem to Istanbul in many ways, predominantly because it they go back so long and have such a rich history of their own, and also the fact that in their own history they acted as some sort of a meeting point of civilizations, and it's really, really very palpable. And it's still a modern city. Then you walk down the street and you sort of feel like the archaeological layers around you. But I'm digressing here. I'd like to ask you whether there are or should be similar studies applying to other cities.
So there are a few books, not many, and it's not. I mean, there's one book by David Henkin on New York before the Civil War, and which is very much, was a great inspiration for my book, because he looks also at a series of artifacts, signs, or text on money, and so forth. It's a very, very different context, so it's different kind of changes and different kind of conclusions. There's a study of text in Fatimid Egypt in the Middle Ages by Ren Beerman. There's not quite the same, but a study of textuality in Yemen in the 19th and 20th century by Brinkley Messick, which is more anthropological, and it's much more about text on paper, but it's also very much aware that writing changes and meaning of writing and reading changes. But not too many of these. It was quite challenging to think of, to find parallels. Hopefully there'll be more. There is, among sociolinguists, there's something called, they have the concept of linguistic landscape, which is about understanding, power relations between languages and the way languages operate in space. So that's kind of similar, but it's much more focused on contemporary than historical. And, they usually come and they see, a street sign and they say, why is this language on top and why is this language missing? And for me, the question was, why do we have a street sign? Why do we have a street nameplate? At what point do people think that there's a need for it? And what is the justification and what is the use? So not taking it as obvious, because these artifacts were introduced at a certain point. It's not like they always existed. And And in Jerusalem, they are introduced mainly in a, under colonial setting. So to understand that was important, and to understand that kind of philosophically, what does it do when you start naming streets and putting signs to make the names official?
Is it philosophical or is it institutional, part of that modern institution building that certainly started under the mandate period and continued, in the form, I'm thinking about mail distribution and tax collection and things like that?
So yes, I mean, a lot of it is about, tightening the grid, the hold of the authorities on the city. And it's very clear with the British. The British want to know where individuals live. They do not want to deal with a mukhtar, with the local delegate or the head of the community. They want an address where they can arrest, tax, not conscript, but they want this kind of level of information. But and that kind of idea of the city as formed of streets and houses is a very European way. That was not the way that the Ottomans or the local residents understood. I mean, they thought much more spatially in terms of neighborhoods and vicinities rather than in a kind of Cartesian way of, we have a grid that, streets, street name and street number, and that allowed that you could have different names for the same street without asking which is the real name, and kind of without imposing one kind of geography over other.
Are we seeing similar patterns in post-67 Jerusalem now under Israeli rule? I mean, not so much. I'd like to use the word colonial, but maybe in inverted commas, because it's not so much about the. What I mean is the way of a regime controlling perhaps hostile indigenous population in those ways that you describe in your book.
So it's interesting. I mean, if we just focus on that kind of address aspect, not quite in the same way. So I mean, we do have instances in which streets are named in a very interventionist way without asking local residents what they think about it. We see it in Silwan and other places. But in many other cases, the municipality did not name the streets. I mean, the streets are unnamed, which provides an excuse why you do not provide services, because we can't find you. And, and we can't deliver mail to your house, so you have to collect it from the shop or from the post office, and we see it. I mean, when the police comes to arrest people in East Jerusalem, they have coordinates rather than street name and street number. So it's kind of GPS style, and through that they don't need names of streets anymore. So that kind of creates also a form of neglect, of underdevelopment of East Jerusalem is partly by the lack of street names, rather than by imposing street names. And we see a local demand for street names, in fact, because of the lack of services.
All right, Dr. Yair Wallach, author of the newly published A City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much.
And big thanks to Ariel Cohen, our producer, and Tai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You can support us by going to our website and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way over 600 interviews.
Maybe even 700.
Maybe even 700.
We should count one day.
Yeah, actually, if you have a spare week, maybe we should sit down and count them. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter. And, of course, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.